The Nets make headlines on Monday by moving away from 3 of the coaches off their staff under Jacque Vaughn. Is this a sign of things to come for where Brooklyn is headed, or is it just standard operating procedure in the NBA? We're going to get into that and more right after the theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, welcome back to the Locked On Nets podcast and the Locked On Podcast Network, your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I am Doug Norrie, owner, operator, DFSR.com. If you need some projections for FanDuel or DraftKings, we've been covering NBA for as long as anyone in the biz over there, DFSR.com. So go check that out. You can grab a free trial for all those projections. No Adam Armbrecht, who's deep and now in a Devils playoff run. He is taking a much-needed off-season break here. Be back later on in the week to get us back rolling side by side on the podcast. For now, though, we still got tons to cover. The offseason never stops. Even when your team gets swept out of the playoffs by the Sixers, who just beat the Celtics without Joel Embiid. News comes at you basically all the time with the way the basketball runs these days. And that was the case for the Nets on Monday, who announced that they had moved off of 3 of the coaches, off of their coaching staff under Jacque Vaughn, and would be looking in different directions when it came to guys who maybe a little bit more end the bench, depending on where you want to look. Igor Kokoskov, Brian Keefe, and Tiago Splitter had all been relieved of their duties as assistant coaches for the Brooklyn Nets. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means in the NBA. I mean, how normal or abnormal it is for coaches to sort of cycle on through an NBA team, what these specific guys meant for the Nets, during their tenure, and maybe some possible names that have been thrown out there going forward about who could replace them. I think the key here to start is that Jacque Vaughn is still the head coach. Obviously, he was the head assistant and then brought in to be the head coach when the Nets moved off of and fired Steve Nash earlier in the season. So just from a high level, it's not all that surprising that the Nets would make some coaching changes here. These guys, some of them, like Igor, were specifically brought on to coach under Nash to help Steve Nash at the time. This is now Jacque Vaughn's staff. He might want to shape it into the way that he sees fit. And this is, to some degree, some of what happens in the NBA with assistant coaching turnover. These jobs tend to be much more fluid than the head coaching position. And it's not crazy for teams, especially teams that made exits early in the playoffs or didn't make the playoffs at all, to move off of coaches in the short term, just because that's just kind of the way it goes. And if you're Jacque Vaughn, where you took over midseason, they weren't going to make any coaching changes underneath him at the time. This situation was a little different. He was moving, sort of just up one rung on the ladder. No one replaced him on the staff. It still stands to reason that this was not the staff that was molded and shaped into the vision that he had with the same number of guys. So it doesn't sound like there's love lost, or it doesn't sound that there's any hard feelings around this. That was reported. And again, this is the kind of thing that does happen in the NBA with teams, that there just tends to be coaching turnover in these ranks because these jobs, just the situations change, the motivations change, the guys at the top like Jacque Vaughn end up changing, and that's sort of the situation you get. With the 3 coaches that the Nets did move off from, Igor Kokoskov, Brian Keefe, and Tiago Splitter, each of them had their own duties with the team, as NBA coaching staffs tend to do. You tend to have a head coach. For those that don't know, you tend to have a head coach, then you have assistants who work on varying levels of the team hierarchy. So usually you'll have a main offensive guy, a main defensive guy, then you'll have player development guys, or just guys that will end up working with either individual or groups of players during development stages, or just during game planning or tape and stuff like that. So just because you're an assistant coach, you tend to have siloed duties when it comes to the overall team. And that was the case here with these guys for the Nets. Igor was an offensive guy. He had come over from Dallas. He had been the Suns head coach in the past. He was a Nash hire. He was there to sort of mold and shape what the offense was going to look like. Brian Keefe, he was hired in 2021. He was more of a defensive guy. He had been rumored, and it's been reported to be in line for the Pistons job at the beginning of the season. And now he might still, with a coaching vacancy there as well, he might be up for that job as well. And then Tiago Splitter had started under player development and then moved up into the assistant coaching ranks as time went on for him. He had been there since 2019. With each of these guys, moving on from Igor and Keefe specifically, I mean, that does, that's something of a ground shift. It's not a monumental move here by the team, but it does signal that they are going to go in new directions with both the offense and the defense. And it's easy to some degree to see why. We can see where some of these stats landed. And if the Nets didn't feel like this was part of what their future held for how they wanted to, put together the team going forward, then moving on from the head guys who again, were not hired by Jacque Vaughn, who were not meant to be directly working under Jacque Vaughn as the head coach when they were originally hired. So there could be some just sort of mutual feelings here about what the overall plan was. But we for sure are looking at a situation where the Nets are going to be moving into new guys, whether that's on their current staff now or outside hires. We'll go through some names that have been floated out in the past, been floated out regarding these vacancies. We could see a new look on the bench that could signal changes on both the offense and the defensive end. And frankly, that's probably like good news. I think that it's always good, especially when something's not super dynamic and overly amazing, to get new heads in there to sort of look at the situation, look at the player personnel, and decide what the best strategies are going forward with the guys that you have. And to know that you're going to be working under Jacque Vaughn as like right from day one, rather than there being shifting around of pieces sort of mid-season, like you get when you fire your head coach, right? They fire Steve Nash. And that a lot of these guys came in thinking they were going to be working for Nash going for the long term. And that just ends up not being the case, because when situations need to change and things get really, really bad, it usually is the head coach that ends up taking the fall. So moving on from Igor here, moving on from Brian Keefe, going to get a new look at both the offense and the defense. We'll go through who is left on the staff for the Brooklyn Nets and some names that were thrown out as possible replacements on the bench for Jacque Vaughn and Sean Marks going forward. Before we get to that, I'm going to let you know this show is sponsored by BetterHelp. It's easy to get caught up from time to time and things you need. It's hard to think about taking time for yourself. It's hard to think about how to maybe better yourself. We all spend our time giving, and sometimes it just makes you feel real stretched thin, really burned out. Therapy can give you the tools to find more balance in your life so you can keep supporting others without leaving yourself behind. You can help learn positive coping skills. You can learn how to set boundaries. It can empower you to be the best version of yourself. Maybe you experience some trauma out there. Maybe you just have things that you like to talk out. This is where BetterHelp can come in. It's great to give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be super convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. All you have to do for BetterHelp, you fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist. You switch therapists anytime. If there's no additional charge there, find someone that works with you. Find more balance with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA. All right, so who is left on the Nets bench right now in terms of their overall coaching staff? They do have 4 assistant coaches now. Again, they had 7 total assistants. They started the season with 8. Jacque Vaughn was one of the assistants, gets moved up to head coach. They never replaced Jacque Vaughn. He was like the head assistant. They don't replace anyone with that title. So they were left with 7 coaches. They let 3 of them go, and now they have 4 remaining. One is Adam Capehorn. It's thought that he is going to step in probably to a much bigger role here. He coached the summer league. If you watch any summer league games, he was the kind of the face of that group at the time. He's really well regarded within the organization There is some speculation that he could maybe move up the ranks here into one of those vacated positions, running one side of the ball. So that's a familiar face if you've been following the team for a little while. I think everyone would feel pretty good about that situation. Not to say that's going to happen, but there were 4 guys on this team that on this coaching staff that were still left. Another one was Ryan Forehand Kelly. If you had watched some Nick Claxton stuff during the offseason, him trying to improve some of the foul shooting, Ryan was one of the guys that ended up working with Claxton. Again, a lot of times assistant coaches end up working with individual players or small groups of players. That was been something that he had been tasked with. Then they also have Trevor Hendry and Royal Ivey. Those of you maybe know Royal Ivey had been tied to Kevin Durant for a while. If you watch ES coverage, Royal was a guy that they tended to interview coming out of halftime. Always gave a great interview. He remains with the staff as well, Texas guy who had been there with Durant. So that is the group that is now that is the remaining group of coaches for this team. Look, things around this situation with coaching is always a little funny because you tend to get like coaching trees. It's not the same exact thing as the NFL where you just get these, different coaching trees and then they all spread out through the rest of the league. But the NBA does have some hallmarks of that. Like, the Nets in the past have been tied to some Spurs stuff. Jacque Vaughn was with the Spurs. Some of these other guys, obviously Tiago Splitter was with the Spurs. We know that some of these, there's sort of holdovers from groups of teams or under specifically coaches that have been there for a long time, like Pop. Like if you've been in the league for a long time, like Greg Popovich, you are going to have a bunch of coaches that presumably go on to bigger and better things off of your staff. Part of that's just a time thing. Another thing is you're good at identifying talent and you're good at just being in the league long enough to cycle through a lot of assistant coaches. So there are Spurs ties within the Nets. Not to say that that's a direction they're definitely going to go going forward with new hires, but that's been something of a theme with the staff in the past. It's important I will say, assistant coaches are sometimes, sometimes you tend not to hear much about them unless one, they are let go, like in situations like this. 2, they've been in the league for tons of time, just because Igor's been in the league for years and years and years now. And they just end up being sort of like perennial assistant coaches. So those names get bandied about a little bit more. Or if they're rumored because they are the next guys that could end up being great head coaches. Like you'll start to hear names floated around. And a lot of times those guys do become great the next head coaches. Like this happened with Darvin Ham. This happened with Will Hardy. Obviously Joe Mazzulla took over for Ime over there in Boston, but his name had been talked about a lot. So you will start hearing rumblings of different guys who could take over head coaching positions in the future because they're maybe on the younger side. They're thought to have some maybe like real pedigree coming up the coaching ranks. But those tend to be like the only times you'll really, really hear assistant coaches get talked about a ton, just because that's just like the nature of the gig. The nature of the gig is a little more low profile outside of team circles. It's just, the head coach ends up becoming the face of the franchise outside of just these out of break interviews, which you get every once in a while. They tend not to get tons of mic time. And that's just the way that the assistant coaching ranks sort of go. Like I said, Brian Keefe, maybe he's going to be in line for a Pistons gig. I'm not sure if that's still, on the table or not for him, but that is what ends up happening when it comes to head coaches in the NBA, just because that's just how things get sort of dissected. With the group that's left, look, we probably hear over the next couple months about what the Nets' plans are in terms of filling up some of these positions. It stands to reason that one or maybe 2 of these guys is going to move up and become just sort of the head of a different section of the team. It makes sense. That would make sense to be the case because these guys specifically were kept on, but I'm not exactly positive because there are some names that have been floated out there. There have been names that have been floated out there who could end up becoming part of this organization in a bigger way, or maybe even jumping over, some of the guys that end up being left here. The great Alex Schiffer, who writes for The Athletic, and covers the Nets as good as anybody in the whole league when it comes to covering a team. He gave a quick breakdown of some guys who could be considered for moving up different spots or just joining the team. And again, this is just a list that would be considered. He's throwing it out there from sources that he has. So it's just not, none of these are for sure going to be the case. But these are guys that may end up joining the staff and probably would be considered to be pretty good hires. They have Ronnie Burrell, who's right now, he's the Long Island Nets coach. They've had a really successful run over the last couple of years. Wouldn't be shocked to see him join the staff. Vaughn has talked highly about him in the past. So, and they've moved guys up from Long Island before, like Adam Capehorn. Like I said, he was on Long Island, and then he ends up becoming part of the staff. So if Ronnie Burrell, who's done a really good job in Long Island, ended up joining the staff, that wouldn't be surprising at all. A couple other guys that Alex mentions. He mentions James Borrego. You might recognize him. He used to be the Charlotte Hornets head coach. He was let go, and then Steve Clifford replaced him. He had worked with Jacque Vaughn in the past in Orlando as the lead assistant there. So they have ties going back. They had time in San Antonio together as well. Borrego, he was, was the run in Charlotte amazing? No. I mean, was that a situation that might be hard to just win? Sure. He did exceed expectations 3 years ago, when it looked like maybe they weren't going to be that good and the team ended up being decent. Don't mind that one. He's also been considered for some head coaching jobs as well. So we'll see where James Borrego ends up landing. It's not, maybe this isn't, it's hard to know exactly how inviting this situation is too. And that's another thing to consider. Like, is the Nets assistant coaching job, a good enough gig for some of these guys? I don't know. Like, in some ways, it doesn't seem like it is. It feels like it's going to be a little bit more development than anything else going forward. But it's, there are ways that this can shake out, depending on sort of beauty is in the eye of the beholder where you think it's going to be. But because Borrego has ties to Jacque Vaughn from the past, it makes sense. Chad Forcier, assistant coach for the Bucks, another guy Alex mentions, another guy who comes from the Spurs line. Could be a type of guy that they want to work in, bring in with player development. He has a track record there, according to Alex, when it comes to the Milwaukee Bucks. Other guys, Chip Engelland, who's currently an assistant coach with the Thunder. Joe Prunty, assistant coach with the Hawks right now, who might be moving on from, or going to be moving on from these guys because Quinn Snyder is up in the mix now there. And then he mentions Brett Gunning, who was a guy that had been previously with the Rockets and the Magic. Also a guy that had been on Jacque Vaughn's staff when he was in Orlando. So you can see how some of these guys end up being connected to Vaughn. I mean, look, Jacque Vaughn's been in the league a long time. The guy's worked with a lot of guys. He's been a head coach in the past. He's been an assistant coach for years and years. He's overlapped with a lot of guys in the past. And, to say that is what happens in the NBA. Sure. Like I said, with Pop, if you end up being in the league for a really long time, you're going to end up overlapping with a lot of different coaches who are up and, depending on where they are on their own timeline. So that's just going to be the case too. It's good. I think it's good from I think Vaughn is a respected guy in the league. I think guys, depending on where they are in their own careers, would want to come and work with him. So I don't think like that would necessarily be a turnoff, but the Nets as an organization, I'm not really sure. Like, guys who had been head coaches in the past, are they going to want to come be an assistant under Vaughn for a team where it's like a little unclear about where they are going in the NBA right now? I'm not really sure. But so it's an interesting list. I'm sure the list will expand some, and we'll begin hearing some rumblings about where this could go in terms of the Nets adding more coaches. And that's always fun to kind of try to sort this stuff out, because you want to try to hire good assistant coaches because they can lead different parts of your team. And if you can catch a guy on the rise who's going to become, a head coach one day, we've seen teams really succeed with this kind of stuff. Like Will and Hardy and Mazzulla were under Ime Udoka, and that those guys end up being great head coach. Really, I mean, what do you think of Mazzulla? But they both become head coaches, And sometimes your assistants can be as big a part, or many times your assistants are as big a part of the process as anything else. So interesting situation going on here for the Nets. I'm sure we're going to get more information as time goes on. Want to close this out in a second, just talking a little playoffs, what we've seen since the Nets exited things, and some interesting news that came out of Memphis. We'll get into that in a second. All right, close out the podcast here, following talking about where the Nets are going, possibly with assistant coaches. Just a couple news and notes around the league. This playoffs continues to be really, really fascinating in terms of just like the overall storylines. Just like sort of like on a night-to-night basis, we're just getting really cool stuff. I hope everyone here is still tuned in to just general NBA action, even though the Nets are out of the mix, because these playoffs have been super, super captivating. A couple old friends in James Harden and Kevin Durant both played on Monday night. Harden had not even probably his best game, his best playoff game of his career against the Celtics. Without Joel Embiid. The Sixers were. Harden drops 45, hit a complete dagger three to close out the game over Al Horford on this little step back. And the Sixers steal a game in Boston to take a 1-0 lead in that series. Harden's game, he looked better in this game than he looked at any point during the Nets series, which is totally, totally wild how good he looked. Kind of shocking, honestly, about how good the Sixers were and that they were able to come out of that game with a win. They were 9-point underdogs going into the game. So for the fact that they were able to beat the Celtics on the road without Joel Embiid, I mean, we've seen a lot of big upsets in the playoffs so far. Obviously, the Heat and being the primary one, but like this Sixer win over the Celtics was definitely one of the biggest upsets you'll see kind of in quite some time. Like, it's sort of unfathomable that they were able to beat the Celtics. But it was basically on the back of Harden. Harden was just super, super efficient, looked like the old version of James Harden. No matter kind of what you think about Harden, as I know if you're a Nets fan, it's really hard to cheer for him just because of how he exited the team. Just from a basketball standpoint, it was a kind of a spectacle to watch. So if you're not tuned into that series, I would definitely go check that one out. That was a really good game. And then you get other old friend Kevin Durant, who is now down 2-0 with the Suns to the Nuggets. They get in a complete rock fight, 97-87. The Nuggets end up winning that one. They go up 2-0 in that series. The Suns have looked just super weird at times. If you're watching that series, they first game, they didn't shoot any threes. It was just crazy how few they shot. I think they shot like 15 threes total in the first game. Second game, they definitely changed that. Durant took 12 on his own. He only made 2 of 12, really struggled from the field. I personally still root for Durant. I don't know how Nets fans feel about this situation. I really enjoyed watching Kevin Durant, really enjoyed covering Kevin Durant. I still kind of root for Kevin Durant here. And so it was kind of a bummer to see him struggle from the field. It was nuts with the Suns because they ended up shooting a ton more threes, couldn't get to the foul line at all. Shot 5 total free throws the entire game. Durant definitely had some qualms here during the game around times he thought he was fouled and was getting really just frustrated at times with what he thought were definitely non-calls. But they end up shooting 5 total free throws. Booker goes 3 for 3. Durant goes 2 for 2. Suns end up losing and are now in kind of real trouble here against Denver. Look, these series can end up changing on a dime. Things can always just go a little differently. It never, you're never as bad as it looks when it starts. Denver definitely has some real advantages at home for sure. But yeah, if I'm a Suns fan, or if you're a Suns fan, you're worried. If you're anti-Durant because you don't like the way that he left or you don't like the way things shook out in Brooklyn, then maybe you're feeling pretty happy about it. Kind of depends how you feel overall with where that ends up landing. All right, a couple other things here with the Miami Heat. That one continues to be this Heat-Knicks series is nuts. It looks like Jimmy Butler, by the time you listen to this, we'll know if Butler is going to end up playing against the Knicks. Julius Randle was questionable. I never figure out why. Someone can explain it to me or I'll look it up here. Why they don't reseed these playoffs? Why wouldn't these teams didn't split up and play the Sixers in Boston? I just don't really know. It always seems weird to me because that seems like how it should have shook out, but it didn't end up doing it. So, these games are going on tonight while we podcast. You'll have the the results of this by the time you listen to it. So we'll already know where Heat and Knicks land. And then you get the Lakers and Warriors, which you got to be on the edge of your seat for, especially after that massive Steph game over the Kings on Sunday, which was that one. I said that one of these games, that Harden game, was the best of his career in the playoffs. Curry's game was like one of the best of all time in the playoffs. That game was completely sick. He was just totally ridiculous, played sort of a different game than he's used to even playing, just from I think he had like an effective usage rate of like 60% or some crazy number in that game, made what felt like everything. So these playoffs, I don't know, if you're a Nets fan and you started tuning out because of the way things shook out for Brooklyn, I totally get it, but I really would suggest like tuning back in, man. These games have been really good. There's some really cool storylines going on in the NBA. Just in terms, really each series has a cool storyline, I think, whether just no matter which way you slice and dice it. And that's a good thing for the NBA. I think we're not in a situation like we'd been in the past where it seemed very obvious around which one or two teams were going to probably end up landing near the top. This thing still feels like totally wide open. And I think that's overall is a really good thing for the NBA, just because it makes it more interesting on a night-to-night basis. And that's definitely the case that we've had here. All right, we're going to get out of here. Hopefully, Mr. Adam Armbrecht will be back tomorrow as we start pairing back up, diving into more stuff with the Nets off season. In the meantime, make sure you like and subscribe. We're over on YouTube, where those numbers continue to climb, even though the Nets are out of it. Much appreciated, everyone that jumped in there over on YouTube. Make sure you like and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Adam's always the one that comes up with the quotes at the end of the podcast. So I got to the end of another podcast and forgot to look a great one up from the great American poets. So for the last time, hopefully for a while, we'll say Adam Armbrecht, one of the great American poets. We'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.